this discussion is based on an article that Rolf Tanner has written in our newsletter, an article on the Spanish flu. I asked him to write this article in an objective, matter-of-fact style, without any opinions and blah blah, just stating facts in a bullet point style. I can really recommend to anybody to read that article. I knew a little bit about the Spanish flu before. When I read his article, there were some things that I recognized, that I knew already before, but just a few things I learned a lot. And I wouldn't say it was like reading a novel, but it was very pleasant to read and very, very instructive. However, he kept to his promise. He didn't put any opinions, no interpretation, just pure facts, which is the charm of his article. But I thought it might be a good idea to invite Rolf and also Michel Dacorogna to have a little discussion, about experts on the Spanish flu and putting the Spanish flu in, of course, today's context. Now, a few words about Rolf. Rolf is a political scientist and a historian. I met you, Rolf, well, about 18 years ago. When you joined Swiss Re, I had already been there for a year. You joined as the head of socio-economical risk. You are still with Swiss Re, in contrast to me. You're still with Swiss Re. You're also teaching at the University of Basel. Michel, we met even before my time at Swiss Re. That was a long time ago. We were still at the Zurich group. You stayed there at the Zurich group with Zurich Re, then Converium, and then SCOR. Ultimately, you were the Deputy Chief Risk Officer. Now you are with Primary Solutions. Congratulations. And you're also teaching in Zurich and several other places. I think it's interesting to establish a dialogue, a discussion between the two of you. Michel, more as a physicist and a quantitative risk manager, and you, Rolf, coming also addressing those same risks, but more from the historical and the socio-economical perspective. So, and when I read your article, I was struck by something that I had already noticed before. It's the similarities between the Spanish flu, which kind of has disappeared of our collective memory to a large extent, except for people like you, like historians. But the similarities, I mean, there were things like the different handlings of the pandemic at that time by different governments, the confinement, also the pressure to release the confinement. I saw also some pictures, people in the context of 100 years ago, but wearing the same masks as we do. So lots of similarities, but well, it's not the same thing. And I wanted to ask you, what are in your mind the major differences between the COVID-19 that we're experiencing and that major historical event?
Thank you, Frank, and also thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak here. Well, when looking back to the Spanish flu, I see essentially three differences with the situation that we have today. And first, I think an important difference to what we had with the Spanish flu is that, of course, the state of medical science and the medical profession is a very different one. You know, I mean, in 1918, this was still relatively primitive. You know, today we talk about having a vaccine by next year. This may not occur actually, but we seem to have this confidence that through concerted medical research, we will be able to come up with a vaccine. There is this basic confidence in the research and development, and that we will succeed. Now, back then, the medical science was still in a much less developed stage. People couldn't even identify the virus until 1931. There were no antibiotics available, there were no ICUs, there were no respiratory aids, and so on. So everything was much more primitive in that sense. So that, I think, is one major difference. Another major difference is that there were no coherent public health policies back then. I mean, there was no WHO organization. There were, in most countries, there was no Ministry of Health or something like that. Public health was almost entirely in the hand of local authorities. And there was only one country in the world which adopted something like a national strategy in coping with the Spanish flu, and that was Japan. And the third difference, I think that's probably the biggest difference, is that the Spanish flu occurred or started during the last year of the First World War. The first wave was in spring 1918, and the second wave was starting sometimes in August. And that was a time when the First World War was very, very much coming to a climax, you know. I mean, it was in spring 1918, it just barely looked as if the Germans were still to win, you know. And in the second half of 1918, everything started turning around with the arrival of 1 million American soldiers and eventually giving the Allies the upper hand on the Western Front. So death was very present at that time. It was something which was an everyday experience, you know, and there was a certain amount of fatalism. There also was a large extent of mental and physical exhaustion, you know, physical exhaustion, which, by the way, has contributed to the spread of the Spanish flu, as has the military situation in general, with these troops crammed into unhygienic camps and so on. So I would say these are the three major differences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, probably also the value of life was not the same as nowadays.
I think it's a very value of life that is, of course, ethically very Latin, a very Latin issue. I don't think that people did not cherish their lives as much as they do nowadays. But
well, their own life, yes, but the life of others.
Exactly. I mean, I think the general attitude, particularly after this First World War, with all that slaughter going on, we must not forget. I mean, that 8 million people were killed on the battlefields. Yes, I think the general approach towards life was somewhat different than from what it is today.
Michel, I know that you've told me several times that you see major differences between the two pandemics.
Yes, and by the way, I agree with what Rolf said. I think he pointed out to some major, and I would like to emphasize the first one about progress in medicine. I am one of those guys who believe in this progress also. You were alluding that the society was very confident in that. By the way, we found a vaccine against Ebola, and I'm sure we will find a vaccine against this coronavirus. But what is very striking already is it took us 3 weeks to decipher the genome of this virus, while it took 3 to 4 years to decipher the genome of AIDS, and probably 10 or 20 years, and I'm not even sure that we have done it completely for the Spanish flu. So it's a very different advance in science than it used to be at the time. I think the power of genetics and the power of medicine in general is nowhere comparable to that time. And the second very major difference I find is the quick, contrary to what people think, the quick reaction in the whole world. Imagine, in the whole world, half of the population is confined in less than 4 months. We learned about this virus beginning of December. Mid-March, already a lot of countries were confined, and end of March, half of the world. is this going to last or is it not going to last? I don't know. But clearly, to me, this strikes me as a completely different response than at the time. At the time, there were doctors that were asking the military not to send the soldiers from the US to Europe, or to check if the soldiers had this flu or not. And this was refused by the army, and they sent them. The results of that, you had more US soldiers killed because of the flu than on the war. 53,000 were killed on the front and 64,000 killed by the flu. So the response is completely different. And I think it has to do with the question and the answer from Rolf before. The way we looked at life at that time was very different. And I think this is an interesting difference. The same thing, they sent back the soldiers from the colonies after the war, and that provoked a third wave. We think, we are not sure, but as Rolf mentioned in his article, we think it produced the third wave of the pandemics in spring 1919. So I think this is a second difference. Now, I would like also to point out here to some point, despite the way to manage the spread of the virus, we may ask ourselves if the high death rate was at that time due to the properties of the virus itself, or rather to the way people were taken in charge by the health system. The Spanish flu case, we know that it was more deadly than for young male adults than the COVID-19. But what was the reason for that? I think if you take the example of Switzerland, it's quite interesting. I have the statistics for Geneva. The median age of the people who were handled in the intensive care of the hospital was 59 years. And the median age of people who died was 84. So you can conclude from that, okay, it was not so deadly for the young adults. I would say the contrary. It was very severe for the young adults, but they were treated very quickly, and that avoided the deaths. So I think this is a question that we should ask ourselves. And by the way, when you hear about the description of how the people were, the young adults that were affected by the Spanish flu, it is very, very similar to this cytokine storm that we have seen in people with the coronavirus. So my opinion here again, I think the way we handle people when they are sick makes a big difference.
Now, Michel, I mean, you are a specialist of extreme events, and definitely this is an extraordinary extreme event in many respects, also economically. Now, and nowadays it's quite fashionable to talk about black swans, and it's become so fashionable that many of our colleagues, actuaries, risk managers, really start imagining some scenarios in all impunity. And you know very well, I mean, it's easy to do it, but then how do you validate that? The question that I'm wondering is to what extent are lessons from the past, are they sufficient to monitor, or do we really have to resort to just picking out something out of thin air?
Okay. First of all, as a specialist of extreme value theory, I resent this notion of black swan, because it was introduced by
Nassim Taleb.
By Nassim Taleb at the time, where he actually did not know about extreme value theory. He learned about it later, and he became good friend with Paul Embrecht in Zurich. But it is the idea that black swans are unpredictable. I am sure they are, but their probability not. Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting thing about it. In fact, I went back and looked at the probability of this event. Okay, we don't have all the numbers now, but to my opinion, I would say the death rate, etc., looks like the Hong Kong flu or something like that. And what we see is that in our model, in our probability model, the probability of that was 1/100 years. So not so improbable. Okay. So then that let me answer your question. Yes, the past is sufficient to predict realistic probability for the outbreak of such pandemic events. And by the way, I wrote a paper in 2013 after a very interesting conference we had in Paris on pandemics, where the possibility of an outbreak of the kind we see now was also judged to be about 1/100 year events, but other experts, not myself or not statistician, but also epidemiologists, etc.
Let me interrupt here just to remind that we mentioned this article in our previous Primary Solutions newsletter. We got we already got a number of feedbacks. Quite a number of those were, why is this article in French and not in English? But well, that's how the cookie crumbles.
Because I was
in Paris.
Chief officer of a French company, and they asked me to write it in French. Right. That's okay. But also Bill Gates, you know, that now it has become a buzz. This conference he gave in 2015, estimating the pandemic as one of the major risks of the future. So we knew about this. So yes, I think the past is sufficient. And the second part of my answer is no. No, it is not sufficient to be prepared for such event. Even as it would deny one constant feature of mankind. We tend to close our eyes on bad outcomes when there is little probability to it. We prefer to ignore it. And by the way, I count myself in it, because when the things happen, I suddenly remembered the article I wrote at the time, and I forgot about it. I read it again, I forgot everything I wrote at that time. So it is human nature, I think. And I have another example of that. After the first SARS epidemics, the French authority asked a committee to write a paper on that. And they wrote a beautiful paper. By the way, I recommend you to read it, in 2013 also. And they recommended to store masks for the next epidemic. Okay? And in mass. In 2014, this report went to the Senate in France. And the Senate dismissed it and said, oh, the private industry is much better equipped to do this. We know what the consequences are, okay? I am in France at the moment, and I cannot leave my place without a mask, but I cannot buy one. So I went to see a person who built one for me.
Cool, all right, stylish.
Okay. I think
Rolf,
an answer on that.
Rolf, what is an historian? Do you think we can trust history?
Well, the question is what we know about history, of course.
Yes.
Because sometimes, and this goes a bit back to your question about what is data from the past sufficient to build a model, and then my counter question, of course, would be, well, if not data from the past, what data else then? You know, I mean, that's a bit the point. You know, although we all know that, of course, the present is never an exact copycat of what has happened in the past. I mean, if we want to upgrade models, there is, of course, still this idea of, well, you should try to merge data from the past with scenario planning, for instance. And I still think that conceptually it's a good idea. The devil is, as always, in the detail, you know, because in the end the scenario is an opinion, you know. So you mix objective and subjective data, and that, of course, is not always an easy thing. I think I would like to go back to what Michel said about preparation of preparing for pandemics and things like that. And I think, and we're going to talk about that, I think, later in the course of the interview, that Pandemics really had disappeared a bit from public memory. Barely anybody knew in the 90s that there actually has been, apart from the Spanish flu, also a pandemic in 1957, the so-called Asian flu. And there was another one in 68, the Hong Kong flu. Most people had forgotten about them, didn't even know about it. And with SARS, this idea that pandemics are an issue came back. And I think almost any developed country, to my knowledge, has had a pandemic exercise, a pandemic staff, and so on. And I mean, also the insurance and reinsurance industry has been dealing with the issue. I mean, Michel, you mentioned your article. I have here a Swiss Re brochure. I think it's from 2005, 80 pages on pandemics, you know. So it has been in the public domain. It has been also in the insurance domain. But I think the one difference, or the one thing which perhaps was which was not so much looked at, was people looked very much at the health implications, the policy implications, but not so much what it then would mean for the economy. And I think that was the thing which perhaps was a bit neglected in these plans, contingency plannings, exercises, what you had. And this is now what I think is very preoccupying for us right now. When we talk about COVID-19.
Yeah, the collapse of the supply chains. Yes,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting. I mean, talk of this collapse of the supply chains. If we go back many centuries ago, the plague in the Middle Ages, or the plague or the plagues, because it was a plague over centuries, but it seems to have affected, if we consider it on Europe, has affected Southern Europe more than Northern Europe. Some parts of Northern Europe were apparently almost unaffected. And some of your historian colleagues claim that explains the rise of the Northern European cities in the Netherlands, Northern Germany, eventually then also the UK, their rise and the demise of Southern Europe as the economic powerhouse of Europe. Now, do you think that that this could happen again? That because of this pandemic or future pandemics, we could now have a rise and a demise of some geographic regions in our world nowadays?
Well, I'm not so much in favor of. I think the thesis you just forwarded is a bit too sweeping, although I would agree perhaps with certain elements of it. I mean, just to go back on this historical bit before looking into the future, I think what we have seen with the plague is that its effects could be felt over decades, for sure. What it is interesting, though, is that the same result had very different effects in very different places. So, for instance, in Western Europe, particularly in England, the fact that so many people died eventually meant that the nobility were deprived of their peasants. So they lacked manual labor in a way. And it shifted the power balance between the aristocrats and the peasantry in favor of the peasantry. So that the peasants were given more liberties. They also were able to demand higher wages and things like that. To reduce the excises and the things they had to give to the church and to the nobility. So you could argue that actually in Western Europe, that effect led to a strengthening of, I wouldn't say democracy, but it has certainly paved the way for more liberties, more rights, and perhaps then over the very long term for democracy. Now in Eastern Europe, which actually was more heavily impacted than Southern Europe, you had exactly the opposite effect, you know, where nobility was able, as a consequence of the plague, to enslave the peasants, to keep them, to actually bind them to their soil, you know, and to their farms. So while in Western Europe the plague facilitated the evaporation of serfdom, in Eastern Europe, it had actually the opposite effect. It actually strengthened serfdom. And as we know, I mean, serfdom was abolished in Russia only in 1861. So that's very late. Now, going back to today, what we clearly can see already right now is that the pandemic is exacerbating, for instance, tensions between China and the United States. You know, I just read in the Washington Post that hardline Republicans are now thinking about claiming reparations from China because they mishandled the outbreak of COVID-19 in the first place. And, you know, there's a whole roster of events or measures they planned from, for instance, not serving treasury bills held by the Chinese, which of course would amount to a partial default of the United States. So that is unlikely to happen, but it clearly is, you know, that you can have hearings on Congress with people attacking China of mishandling it. You know, and as we know in Chinese culture, it's important to keep face and things like that. This type of public shaming and blaming, of course, would exacerbate tensions between China and the United States much more. So I think we see it already to some extent happen.
Mm-hmm. Michel, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I said they accuse China of mishandling the pandemics. They should accuse Trump of doing the same, even more. So, but that just was a small.
Yeah. No, I think you raise a good point. You know, I mean, the question is a bit. You know, I mean, how is this crisis also impacting on the phenomenon of populism, which we have seen in Europe, also in the United States, of course. You know, and I think in the US. I think Donald Trump indeed did not make or did not give a very competent impression of handling the crisis. However, we also have to say that, of course, from a constitutional perspective, health management is indeed not a presidential prerogative. It's actually something which is managed on the state level. So in that sense, even if he wanted to do something, he couldn't do that much, you know. But that's just a footnote. In Europe, for instance, I mean, Viktor Orban has clearly seized the opportunity to inject even more authoritarianism into his regime. We also see similar tendencies in Southeastern Europe. I mean, just what has happened in Serbia, in places like that, small countries, I agree, but still. And I mean, it's from what we know, it certainly has not hurt Xi Jinping, who is a much more authoritarian Chinese leader than his predecessors. And also, I mean, Narendra Modi in India, I mean, just imagine what he has been able to do. I mean, he ordered tens of millions of laborers to return to their home villages and actually enforcing that to them to either go back or to be somewhere stuck in a transit camp. And that's only possible because he's governing the country in a much more authoritarian way than his predecessors did, and this actually buffers and buttresses this authoritarianism. So going back to your question, Frank, yes, it will have also political consequences. This whole
how about, Michel, how about the economical consequences? Do you think that some regions of the world will become the economical winners and others the losers?
In a crisis of this dimension, I think it's not unusual to see redistribution of power among in the world. Remember the First World War. After the First World War, it became very apparent that Great Britain was not the world power anymore, and it was more the US who became this world power. But you have to be careful. This process didn't happen during the First World War. It happened before, because the power of the American economy started much earlier than 1914. Basically, it really started at the end of the 19th century. So I think it's just that things become more apparent, and it is possible that China will go out of this. We don't know yet the end of the crisis. We don't know if we will not have a second wave. We don't know how much the economy of the world will be hit by it. But it could happen that China goes out of this as the new superpower in the world, and by the way, that their regime is more efficient, which I personally don't think, but it could appear like this. And I think that's the big question mark I have for the consequences of this is, will the Chinese people accept the message of Xi Jinping saying that he won the virus, or would they say, because of you, it became such a big story? So we don't know that yet. It's too early to say.
Yeah.
But definitely, I mean, as I was fascinated by the remarks by Rolf, I think what you learn from history is that events of such magnitude, they make more apparent shift of powers. So it's still a question mark, but the word afterwards will show more of certain things.
I like to challenge that, because I mean, we take first World War I. This is definitely there in our collective memory. Spanish flu, no, it has disappeared. I mean, some intellectuals like you and me knew it happened, but
it could happen.
You see that this is home office, and some people have fun there next door. So, but this, for me, this Spanish flu has really disappeared of our collective memory. In contrast to World War I, but more people died due to the flu. And I'm wondering, is this something that may happen again to COVID-19? Although COVID-19, economically, it's already clear now at the beginning of the crisis, because probably, I mean, there are good chances this, we've only seen the begin. This is just the begin of the first wave. How many other ways are there? But we already know now that economically, this is much, much bigger than the crisis 10 years ago, the banking crisis. So do you think eventually in 10, maybe 20 or 30 years from now, people will have forgotten the COVID-19?
I think mankind has a strong tendency to forget hard times without taking the lessons of it. I think it was a bit what I was telling you before about the models that we knew, but the fact of people not wanting to know. Who does still remember the big eruption of the volcano Mount Tabora in 1815, which caused the year without summer in Europe and in Western, and many, many deaths of famine. We still owe to this Frankenstein, because Mary Shelley wrote it during the summer of 1816, stuck in Geneva, actually, in Switzerland. But we remember much more the Napoleonic Wars as this eruption. So I think people who lived through this exceptional time will remember. And I would say our children will remember, because they were barred from school for a few months. I have had this situation once when I was living in Egypt, and I still remember it 50 years or 60 years later. So those are the kind of things we will remember. Unfortunately, I would tend to agree with you. We won't remember, but I still do hope that we will take the measure to avoid, again, to have, there is a technical word for what we have seen in this pandemic. It's called a zoonosis, because the viruses come from the animals to mankind. And this has been a repeating pattern in the last pandemics. It was the case for AIDS, it was the case for Ebola, and it's the case for this COVID-19, and it was the case for the I don't know the name exactly. With the SARS, I think it was the birds that bring that. So I think we should at least take measures against this in the future. And hopefully that would be the good remembrance of this crisis for me.
What do you think, Rolf?
I think I tend to agree with Michel. I think there is, when you look back into history, I mean, there clearly is people react differently to man-made disasters than they do to, and I would regard now, say, a war or something like that as a man-made disaster in comparison to a natural catastrophe. And with natural catastrophe, I mean anything from earthquakes, hurricanes to pandemics or famines, you know, which very often are also man-made disasters, but that's a different story. So I think that's very much the case, you know. I mean, also you have so much literature about people writing about their experience in war. I'm not really aware of a literature masterpiece writing about a pandemic or something like that. I mean, Camus wrote La Peste, but that's more a metaphorical thing, you know. It's not so much a health book in that sense, you know. I think perhaps one thing which could be slightly different this time is, of course, that we may remember the economic downturn, you know, and that, of course, because we remember the economic downturn, could also mean that we remember COVID-19. But there much, of course, depends. How much is that? Is it a V recession? Is it a U recession? Or is it an L recession? You know, I mean, if the L recession, an L recession essentially is a depression, and that, of course, is then a very different thing. You know, if it's a V-shaped recession, yeah. And the other thing I think is what Michel briefly alluded to is this. I mean, what's the impact on young people? I mean, they certainly will remember. I think sometimes this generation has been described as having been a generation which never had been exposed to real hardship, you know, and some people ridiculed them as the snowflake generation.
Oh. That's us too. That includes almost everybody alive.
It includes us to some extent as well, but I think we still had one thing which was different. We grew up under the specter of nuclear holocaust being able to erupt almost every minute. You know, I think that's a different thing. And you could argue, of course, young people have now the same thing about climate change, but climate change is something which is progressing much slower, and you can still influence it. You know, missiles coming in with 20-minute lead time, that's a different story. But what the impact will be on this generation, I would not underestimate the resilience of these people. You know, I think it's but we don't know. I mean, as so often in this crisis, eventually we don't know. We will see how it plays.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, talking of resilience, what I found interesting in your article also, you talked a little bit about the insurance, and it turns out that in the Spanish flu, yes, there was an impact on the insurance industry, but mainly or almost only the life insurance. Yeah. And it turns out it was very short-lived. So do you think that COVID-19 will reshape to some extent part of our insurance? I mean, beyond life insurance. I mean, credit insurance will be impacted, business interruption also, and so. But how sustainable is this impact going to be? And do you also think, extending that question, is there a role that the insurance industry can play in such a human disaster that we're living through?
No, I think. You asked at the very beginning of this interview, you asked me what are the differences. I mean, one of the differences of all is, of course, also that insurance penetration back then, of course, was much lower. You know, I mean, it was, and life insurance, in fact, was in comparison to non-life, was much stronger. You know, because it had begun earlier. So, in that sense, the impact on the insurance industry this time is most likely going to be much more widespread, you know, than it was back with the Spanish flu. And I mean, we have already seen now. I think this. I only can't speak for the reinsurance side, but this week we had, of course, two companies, SCOR and Swiss Re, publishing their quarterly results. You know, we have already seen some traces in their balance sheets. You know. First hits are on special lines like event cancellation and so on. Of course, we will see credit insurance, health insurance, impact. On the asset side, much depends, of course, how the markets will develop. Goes back to what I said before: is it a V-shaped or a U-shaped recession? I mean, we need to remember that the insurance industry, and I showed this brochure by Swiss Re a couple of minutes ago. I mean, it's not a risk which is unexpected in that sense. You know, we have been working on that for the last 20 years, certainly since SARS, tightening wording and exclusions, particularly also around business interruption. You know. And the thing to me to see is a bit, there is now pressure in the US to relax that wording, and also to have business interruption to be included, even if there is a non-physical event. And
retrospectively. And retrospectively. And of course, this is not new that you have in a crisis situation this type of pressure on the insurance industry to pay out, even though it would not be technically obliged to do so. We had that after 9/11, we had that after Katrina, and so on. And we know that in some cases, of course, the insurance industry paid out, although they were not legally obliged to do so. Because, I mean, the wording was, well, I mean, San Francisco is a classical case in 1906 that fire following was excluded, but the insurance industry still paid in order to keep their good reputation, and actually helped to build them the reputation. But I think the difference here really is that this was really one line, you know, this was one event, one line. Now we're talking about something which is much more systemic, you know, going through the entire economy, and that's not in the interest of governments to destroy the insurance, their own insurance industries or international insurance industry. But we all know, I mean, the interest of the national government is one thing, and the opinion of a jury in a judicial hellhole in Louisiana, of course, can be a very different level, you know. Yeah. So I don't think that in the end the insurance industry in its breadth will be obliged to take responsibility for claims which are not legally entitled. But there may be some tinkering around the fringes. Okay. Michel, do you think that we insurers, we going to sustainably think and act differently?
Difficult question. First of all, maybe on the consequences of this pandemic. I think the difference with the Spanish flu is that in the Spanish flu, you had a lot of young adults and male adults that died, which probably had also life insurance. I think today the life insurance will be less hit because it's essentially very old people who die and the young don't. But we will see. I mean, the whole thing is not finished yet. And there are lines of business which actually are performing very well with this. You know that I told you I'm in France. The Maif, with the largest motor insurance in France, they decided to give back money to the member of the mutual because there is no accident anymore. People don't drive. So it's the same. I think airlines. Okay, that's a different story because we don't get premium, but airlines don't fly, so you don't. There is no insurance. So is a mixed story. Yes, it's systemic. Yes, if the economy goes very well, then we might have problems with the asset side of the investment side. Although you know, I'm just finishing a research paper on procyclicality. And what you see is that when you measure risk in the middle of the crisis, you usually overestimate it. And not because you are not intelligent, not because you don't see the future. It's just the way you measure it. Because you measure it in periods where there is a very high volatility, so you will tend to believe that it will continue like this. So I'm not personally so pessimistic regarding the recovery of the economy. I think it will take time, but it will come back. Now, what about the particular role of insurance to play? As in every crisis, the insurance industry will have, on one hand, to take part of the burden, and you alluded to that. I think there are companies, if they want to keep their market and the trust of their clients, they will have to in certain cases, pay even though they were not legally obliged to pay. We will see things like that. There is, for instance, I was reading in the newspaper, there was an insurance company that refused to pay epidemic covers because they say this is a pandemic. I think this is going to harm the industry if it continues like that.
That's a reputation.
Probably it will not stand in front of a judge. On the other hand, I think historically the insurance industry has always played a very big role in prevention. In car insurance, in fire, they pushed Switzerland. Yes, in Switzerland they financed fire brigades. They posed the obligation to have sprinklers, etc. Maybe they will now ask us to wear masks during pandemics.
Yep. You mentioned there shortly about if the crisis with on our asset side we might have problems. That's obvious. But do you think that people, insurance companies, but overall that people will invest, or people or companies will invest differently after this experience?
This is a good and I think complex question. One thing we have seen, the shareholders of Zoom might be very happy at the moment because their share price is skyrocketing. And in general, if you look at the performance of different sectors, you see the companies that work more in the sustainable, what they call sustainable economy, have been performing much better lately. I think here again, there are interesting things. This morning I was listening to the radio and they were explaining that they expect that the carbon gas emission will be reduced by about 5% only over the whole year. And the reason for that is that most of the carbon emission comes from electricity production and heating. And those things we haven't stopped, and we are not stopping. While, just to give you an idea about the numbers, if we want to go back to the 1990s in terms of carbon dioxide in the Earth, we should reduce it by 7.5% over the next 10 years. So people are now also realizing that, okay, this carbon dependence on the economy, you also see it in times of when the economy goes down, and this might also change a little bit the way people look at this. People realizing the importance of moving away from producing energy with carbon, I think could bring people to, we have seen, for instance, I don't know how much we can believe it, but BlackRock was saying they wanted to move from carbon industry, their investment, and BlackRock is a real giant, okay? They manage 3,000 billion. So if they decide to do things like that, it will affect the economy. So yes, I think it will, but again, as I said before, it's not something new. It will reinforce tendencies, processes we have seen. They put them more to light.
Rolf?
Yeah, I can just pick it up from where Michel left it. I think I absolutely agree with him. It reinforces trends and tendencies which we have been seeing before, for the good and for the bad. You know, I think for both. I mean, one thing, of course, is that now in crisis mode, all the central banks have gone back to quantitative easing and all these measures. You know, so we will see another bout of financial repression. Which is of course a difficult investment environment for large asset manager, including life insurance, and it creates also a bit of a paradox, you know, because in crisis time people tend to invest in a more conservative way, you know, but the assets you actually would like, what a conservative investor prefers, namely bonds, government bonds, are now exactly the type of investment instruments which simply have no return anymore. Will not have any return for the foreseeable future. So this is a further disincentive for saving. At the time when indeed a large part of the population or population at large should think about investing long term and creating returns for themselves, given the fact that with more government debt piled on already large amounts of government debt, it means that pension systems become even more rickety going forward. So it's not that I have a better idea. I think right now there's no alternative to what central banks and governments have been doing, but already in 2008 and 2009, there were claims that governments must then, once the economies are running again, scale back their extraordinary measures very rapidly. This has not happened, or to very, very, very minor extent, And living here in Switzerland, I mean, you may have seen that in the news as well. I mean, Switzerland has been reducing government debt from 240 billion Swiss francs to around 190 or something like that over a time period of 20 years. Now this saving effort is just wiped out by events of this year. Not that this is an extremely high depth of a high level of government debt we have in Switzerland, but it simply shows you how easy it is to do the expenses, about how difficult it is then to go back. And I can only hope that it will work much better this time than it worked in 2009 or 10.
Gentlemen, I wish I could say that well, this is the time to invest in primary solutions, but let's not be facetious. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the time you took, for your deep insights. As always, for me, it's always fantastic to discuss with you and benefit from your knowledge and also your way of thinking and combining things. I hope that our viewers have also enjoyed this discussion. And if you have any questions, please just contact us through our website. And if you have any particular questions to Michel or to Rolf, we will forward them your questions. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Viewers, thank you very much too. And bye-bye. See you all soon. Cheers.
Yes.
Bye-bye.